The door didn't just open, it dissolved the barrier between the storm outside and the absolute stillness within. I hadn't even raised my hand to knock. Rainwater dripped from the hem of my delivery poncho, pooling on the marble threshold, a dark stain against the aggressive purity of the white interior. The woman standing there didn't blink. She didn't look at the soaked bouquet of hydrangeas cradled in my arms. She looked directly at my face, her gaze landing with a physical weight. There was no surprise in her eyes, no confusion about a delivery she hadn't ordered. She looked like she had been counting the seconds until I arrived. I stepped inside because the invitation was silent and non-negotiable. The air in the penthouse was different, cool, conditioned, and smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. It was a gallery, not a home. Massive canvases dominated the walls, slashes of violent color against the stark white, and sculptures of twisted metal stood like sentinels in the corners. The silence stretched, tight as a drum skin. I felt the specific, humiliating heat of my own intrusion. I looked down at the slip of damp paper in my hand. Unit 404. I glanced back at the open door. The gold number mounted there was 402. My stomach dropped, a sharp, vertical vertigo. I had walked into the wrong life. I think my voice cracked, dry despite the humidity clinging to my skin. I think I have the wrong apartment. These are for the penthouse in the East Wing. The woman, Cleo, though I wouldn't know her name until the world tilted on its axis, didn't step back to let me leave. She stepped forward. She moved with a predatory grace, silent on the polished floor. She was taller than me, wearing a silk blouse that looked like it cost more than my van, her dark hair pulled back to reveal the sharp, aristocratic line of her jaw. "You're not leaving," she said. It wasn't a command exactly. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same precision she might use to date a Renaissance oil painting. She stopped. The proximity was sudden and overwhelming. I could smell her now, sandalwood and something colder, like steel. She reached out, not for the flowers, but toward them. Her hand hovered near the blooms, her fingers long and deliberate. She wasn't looking at the hydrangeas anymore. She was watching my hands. Specifically the way my knuckles were white where I gripped the plastic wrapping. "The arrangement is unbalanced," she murmured, her voice low, vibrating in the space between us. "You usually favor asymmetry. Why did you force them into a sphere today?" The question froze me. I stared at her, the water dripping from my hair onto my nose forgotten. The customer requested a round bouquet. The customer has no taste. She finally lifted her eyes to mine. They were dark, intelligent, and completely unflinching. "And you hated making it. I could tell by the way you held the shears this morning. You hesitated before every cut." The air thickened, charged with a sudden, terrifying intimacy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "How do you know that?" "I watch you," she said simply. There was no shame in it, no hesitation. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, I stand outside the glass. You bite your lip when the stems are too thick. You talk to the peonies when you think no one is listening." She took a step closer, invading my personal space, until I had to tilt my head back to hold her gaze. The distance between us closed, electric and heavy. This wasn't about flowers. It never had been. She hadn't opened the door because she wanted a delivery. She opened it because she wanted to see if I would finally walk into her trap. "I didn't order these," she said, her voice dropping to a register that curled around my spine. "But I have been waiting for you to bring them." I stood there, paralyzed by the sudden shift in gravity. The mistake on the delivery slip felt irrelevant now, a tiny error that had led to a massive, inevitable collision. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, a chaotic backdrop to her absolute stillness. She was studying me, not like a person, but like a piece of art she was considering acquiring. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to look away. "Put them down," she said softly. "We need to discuss the lighting." "The lighting?" I managed to whisper. "For you," she clarified, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "The light in here is unforgiving. I want to see if you can withstand it." I set the hydrangeas down on a console table that looked like a slab of suspended obsidian. The plastic wrapping crinkled, a sharp, cheap sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the gallery-like silence. It was the sound of a mistake, of something disposable intruding on something permanent. But Cleo didn't flinch. She dismissed the error of the delivery address with a slight wave of her hand, as if the numbers on the door were merely suggestions that reality had corrected for her benefit. Fate is rarely efficient, she said, her back to me now as she walked toward the wall of glass that looked out over the gray, weeping city. But it is usually precise. You didn't come here by accident, Iris. You came because the symmetry upstairs was suffocating you. My name sounded different in her mouth. Heavier, like a stone dropped into a deep well. I hadn't told her my name. The realization pricked at the back of my neck, but the fear was subordinate to a strange, magnetic curiosity. I should have turned around. I should have mumbled an apology, grabbed the flowers, and fled back to the safety of my van. But my feet felt rooted to the polished concrete floor. I need to go, I said, though the words lacked any real conviction. My boss will wonder where I am. Let him wonder. Cleo turned. The light from the storm outside cast her in silhouette, cutting a sharp figure against the gloom. I have a proposition, one that requires your specific disorder. She gestured upward, a graceful, sweeping motion that encompassed the ceiling and whatever lay above it. The rooftop garden. It was designed by a man who believes nature should be disciplined. He planted boxwoods in perfect squares. He arranged the tulips like soldiers. It is technically flawless, and it is completely dead inside. She walked back toward me, her heels clicking a slow, deliberate rhythm. I've seen the window boxes you keep behind your shop, the ones you think no one notices. Wild jasmine tangling with nightshade, ferns spilling over the concrete like water. It's wild. It's exactly what I need. You want me to garden for you? The question felt absurd. I was a delivery girl who sometimes arranged the discount stems. I wasn't a landscape architect. I want you to curate, she corrected. The air between us compressed, thick with the scent of ozone and her expensive, smoky perfume. I want you to bring that messy, vital energy up here. I want you to ruin the perfection. I shook my head, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. I can't. Shop policy says we don't do private landscaping, and I don't have the time. I'm not hiring the shop. Her voice dropped, losing its professional edge and gaining a texture that felt dangerously intimate. It was the voice of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, not by force, but by the sheer gravity of her desire. I'm commissioning you, the artist, not the employee. She reached into the pocket of her silk trousers and pulled out a key card. It was matte black, unbranded, anonymous. She held it out, not pushing it toward me, but letting it hover in the charged space between us. An invitation. A challenge. Come whenever you want, she said. Dawn, dusk, midnight. The security team will be instructed to let you pass. No schedules, no oversight. Just you, the soil, and whatever you decide to bury in it. I looked at the card. It was a small thing, but it felt incredibly heavy, as if it carried the weight of the entire building. Taking it meant admitting that she was right, that I was bored with symmetry, that I was starving for a canvas that wouldn't wilt in a week. It meant admitting that I liked the way she looked at me, with that terrifying, unflinching precision. And if I say no? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Cleo smiled then, a slow, predatory curving of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. You won't. You're already thinking about which vines would shatter the lines of the pergola. She was right. I reached out. My fingers brushed hers as I took the card, a brief electric contact that sent a shockwave up my arm. Her skin was cool, dry, and terrifyingly steady. The soil is deep, she murmured, her eyes locking onto mine, holding me there while the storm raged outside. Don't be afraid to dig. I turned and walked to the elevator, the black card burning against my palm. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of her standing alone in the white room, but the atmosphere didn't clear. The air in the elevator felt thin, insufficient. As I descended 40 floors, I realized the charge pressure wasn't just in the penthouse. It was clinging to my clothes, sinking into my skin. I had walked in to deliver flowers, but I was leaving with a commission to dismantle a world. The wholesale flower market at 4 a.m. is not a place for the delicate. It is a cavernous, concrete lung that breathes in diesel fumes and exhales the crushing green scent of 50,000 cut stems. It is loud, aggressive, and unapologetically ugly under the buzzing sodium lights. This is my domain. In the shop, I might be quiet, fading into the background behind a counter while customers overlook me. But here, in the cold, wet dark, I am a predator. I move with a speed that surprises people, dodging carts loaded with heavy buckets, my eyes scanning for the slightest bruise on a petal, the faintest hint of rot in a stem. I don't ask for permission here. I take what I need. The floor is slick with water and discarded leaves, a treacherous landscape that requires heavy boots and sharp elbows. I was deep in a heated exchange with Marco, a vendor who had been trying to offload second-rate peonies on me for 3 years. He was shouting, waving a damp receipt in my face, but I wasn't flinching. I had his wrist in one hand and a bundle of subpar stems in the other, pointing out the brown edges with a ruthless efficiency. "They're blown, Marco," I said, my voice cutting through the industrial roar. "They won't last 24 hours. I'm paying for the ones in the back cooler, the ones you're saving for the high-end hotels, or I'm walking." He cursed, threw his hands up, and marched toward the cooler. I smiled, a sharp, private victory, and tossed the rejected bundle back into the water. "I didn't know you had teeth." The voice didn't belong to the market. It was too smooth, too cultured, sliding through the chaotic noise like a silk ribbon through gravel. I spun around, my heart doing a traitorous double beat. Cleo was standing by a stack of wet cardboard boxes, looking like she had just stepped out of a noir film. She wore a trench coat the color of storm clouds, belted tight at the waist, and her heels didn't seem to touch the grime on the floor. She was impeccably out of place, a vision of high-contrast elegance against the gritty, gray morning. Yet she didn't look lost. She looked like she owned the building and was simply inspecting the plumbing. "You're watching me again," I said, wiping my damp hands on my apron, suddenly conscious of the dirt smeared on my cheek and the unraveled state of my bun. "I never stopped," she replied, stepping closer. The crowd surged around us, men shouting, carts rattling, but she created a pocket of stillness. "I like this version of you, Iris. The one who grabs a man by the wrist and tells him exactly what he's worth. It's instructive." She wasn't looking at the flowers. She was looking at my mouth, then my hands. The compliment wasn't about my skill as a florist. It was a hungry acknowledgement of my capacity for violence, however small. The air between us shifted, becoming humid and heavy, charged with a sudden, confusing desire. "I have to be tough here," I defended, though my voice lacked its earlier bite. "If I'm not, they'll sell me the garbage." "Oh, I know," Cleo murmured. A forklift beeped aggressively behind her, forcing her to step forward, closing the final inch of distance between us. She was so close I could feel the heat radiating from her coat, could smell that expensive, smoky perfume mixing with the raw scent of crushed greens. "You're ruthless. It's a quality I admire. Most people are too afraid to demand quality. You demand it like it's your birthright." She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of my flannel shirt, a touch that burned through the fabric. She picked up a single ranunculus from my pile, twirling the stem with a terrifying dexterity. "You chose the difficult ones. These require constant attention." "They're worth it," I said, breathless. "Yes," she agreed, her eyes locking onto mine, dark and unflinching. "My car is outside. The trunk is empty. Let me drive you and your spoils back. I want to see how you handle things when the space is tight." It wasn't a request for a ride. It was a demand to extend the intimacy. "Okay," I whispered, "but you can't care about the dirt." "Iris," she said, her smile sharp. "I'm counting on it." The air 40 stories up is thin, cleaner than the exhaust-heavy soup of the street level, but it carries a strange, hollow quality. It's quiet in a way that feels expensive, the kind of silence that has to be purchased. I had spent the last 3 hours on my knees, dismantling the rigid geometry of the previous landscaping. The boxwoods were gone, replaced by the unruly climbing jasmine and dark, velvety chocolate cosmos I had hauled up in the freight elevator. My hands were buried wrist-deep in a mixture of peat and loam, the cool dampness of the soil grounding me, while the wind whipped loose strands of hair across my face. It was physical, grounding work. I could feel the ache settling into my shoulders, a familiar, comfortable burn that usually allowed me to disappear into the rhythm of planting. But I couldn't disappear here. Not with Cleo sitting 10 feet away. She wasn't working. She was reclining on a low teak lounge chair, a glass of water sweating on the table beside her, a tablet resting forgotten on her lap. She hadn't swiped the screen in 20 minutes. She was watching me. It wasn't the casual observation of a bored homeowner checking on the hired help. It was a study. I could feel the weight of her gaze tracking the movement of my hands as I teased apart a root ball. It felt tactile, like a physical pressure against the back of my neck, heavier than the sun beating down on us. Every time I shifted my weight, every time I reached for the trowel, I was acutely aware of being perceived. It made my movements stiffer, more deliberate. I wasn't just gardening anymore. I was performing a primitive ritual of creation for an audience of one. I paused to wipe the sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist, exhaling a long, shaky breath. The city below was just a geometric abstraction of gray and glass, irrelevant. The only reality was this rooftop, the smell of turned earth, and the woman who was dissecting me with her eyes. "You're tense," Cleo said. Her voice didn't have to travel far to reach me. The wind seemed to carry it directly to my ear. I sat back on my heels, not turning around yet. "I'm focusing. These roots are bound tight. If I'm not careful, I'll snap them." "You treat them like they can feel it," she observed. I heard the soft click of her glass being set down, then the rhythmic tap of her heels on the slate pavers. She was moving. The space between us, which had felt like a safety buffer, began to collapse. "They can," I said, finally turning to face her. "In their own way. Shock kills them faster than drought." Cleo stopped directly in front of me, blocking the sun. Her shadow fell over me, cooling the heat on my face, but doing nothing for the heat rising under my skin. She looked impeccable, of course. Linen trousers that defied creases, a silk camisole that caught the wind. And then there was me. Stained knees, dirt under my fingernails, smelling of fertilizer and effort. The contrast was sharp enough to cut. She crouched down. It was a fluid motion, bringing her face level with mine. She didn't mind the dirt. She ignored it with the same arrogance she used to ignore the delivery numbers. She was close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to see the way her pupils dilated as she looked at me. "You have something..." She trailed off, her voice dropping an octave. She didn't finish the sentence with words. Instead, she reached out. I stopped breathing. I froze, my dirty hands hovering uselessly in the air, terrified of touching her pristine clothes. Her hand came up, cool and steady, and her thumb brushed against my cheekbone. The contact was electric, shocking in its intimacy. She pressed down slightly, dragging her thumb slow and hard across my skin, wiping away a smudge of dark earth I hadn't known was there. She didn't pull away immediately. Her hand lingered, cupping my jaw, her thumb resting near the corner of my mouth. She looked at the dirt on her own skin, then back at my eyes, as if she had just taken a sample of me for analysis. "Chaos suits you, Iris," she murmured. "You wear it better than anyone I've ever met." "I'm a mess," I managed to whisper, my voice catching in my throat. "No," she corrected, her thumb tracing the line of my lower lip. Not quite touching it, but close enough that I could feel the ghost of the pressure. "You're raw material. There's a difference." She finally dropped her hand, but she didn't stand up. She stayed there, in the dirt, with me, looking at the tray of delicate, purple-veined orchids waiting to be planted. "Tell me about these," she commanded softly, nodding at the flowers. "They're difficult," I answered, trying to regain some semblance of professional composure. "They need specific conditions. They burn if the light is too direct, but they wither in the dark. You have to find the exact edge of the shadow. You have to pay attention to them every day, or they close up." Cleo hummed, a low sound that vibrated in her chest. She looked from the flowers to me, her gaze heavy with a meaning that had nothing to do with horticulture. High maintenance, sensitive to exposure, requiring a firm but careful hand. She leaned in, her voice a velvet whisper right against my ear. "I think I'm going to enjoy keeping them alive." The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the roof. The light turned golden and heavy, thick like honey. It changed the atmosphere from a workspace to something private, something enclosed. Cleo stood up slowly, the movement languid, and offered me her clean hand to pull me up. I took it, staining her palm with my soil, but she didn't let go. She held my grip tight, pulling me into the standing position until we were chest to chest, the sunset burning around us, the tension finally rooting deep in the soil we stood on. The transition from the rooftop was a shock to the system. My boots left faint, dusty impressions on the dark hardwood, a trail of evidence that I was intruding on a space too perfect for my mess. I stopped just inside the threshold, my throat parched, the dust of the potting soil coating the back of my tongue. Cleo moved to the kitchen island, a monolith of white marble that looked cold enough to freeze water on contact. She didn't offer me a seat. She didn't offer me a towel. She reached for a crystal pitcher, the condensation on the glass catching the dim, recessed lighting, and poured a single glass of water. The sound of the liquid hitting the ice was sharp, amplifying the thirst that was clawing at my throat. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving mine over the rim of the glass. She swallowed slowly, deliberately. I watched the movement of her throat, mesmerized and desperate. I shifted my weight, my hands clasping behind my back, waiting for her to pour a second glass, waiting for the polite social contract to kick in. It didn't. Cleo set her glass down with a soft click. She leaned her hip against the marble, crossing her arms, studying me with that terrifying focus. "You're thirsty," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," I lied, the words scraping against my dry palate. "You're lying," she countered, her voice dropping to that low, vibrating register that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest. "And you're doing it badly. You've been working in the sun for 3 hours. You're dehydrated. There is a pitcher of water right here. Why are you standing 5 feet away waiting for me to read your mind?" "I didn't want to impose," I murmured, looking down at my dirty boots. "Impose?" she laughed, a short, dry sound. "You're already in my house, Iris. You're tracking soil across a floor imported from Italy. We are past the point of imposition. This isn't about politeness. It's about fear." She picked up the pitcher again. She didn't pour. She just held it, the water sloshing gently against the glass. "You move through the world apologizing for the space you take up," she said, her voice softening, becoming less of a critique and more of a lesson. "You wait for permission to breathe. It's exhausting to watch. And it's boring." The word stung. Boring. "I'm not boring," I whispered, a spark of defiance igniting in my chest. "Then prove it," she challenged. "Tell me what you want. Precisely. No hedging. No, if it's not too much trouble. Just the want." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air charged with a specific, thick tension. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was just water. It was a simple biological need. But the way she looked at me, with that unflinching expectation, turned it into a confession. I looked at the pitcher. I looked at her hands, strong and elegant, holding the thing I needed. "I want a glass of water," I said. My voice was quiet, but steady. Cleo tilted her head. "Better, but you're still asking the air. Ask me." I took a breath, the air conditioning feeling cold in my lungs. I stepped forward, closing half the distance between us. I forced my eyes to meet hers, to hold that heavy, dark gaze that usually made me want to hide. "Cleo," I said, the name feeling heavy and intimate on my tongue. "I want you to give me some water." Her eyes darkened. A slow, satisfied smile touched the corner of her mouth. She didn't break eye contact as she reached for a second glass, heavy crystal, etched with geometric patterns. She poured, the sound rich and promising. But she didn't slide it across the counter. She held it out, just within her reach, forcing me to step into her personal space to take it. "Come and get it," she murmured. I walked to the edge of the island. The scent of her, sandalwood, rain, and something sharper, like ink, filled my senses. I reached for the glass. My fingers brushed hers, the contact lingering longer than necessary, the cold condensation transferring from her skin to mine. I didn't pull away. I took the glass, but I didn't drink immediately. I held her gaze, acknowledging the shift. The transaction wasn't about hydration anymore. It was about the texture of obedience and the thrill of command. "Good," she whispered, the praise landing like a physical touch. "Next time, don't make me wait for you to ask." I drank the water in one long draft, the cold liquid soothing my throat but doing nothing to cool the heat rising in my cheeks. I set the glass down, feeling unraveled, as if she had taken me apart and put me back together with a slightly different design. I left the penthouse 5 minutes later, but the lesson didn't stay behind. It followed me down the elevator, a ghost sensation on my skin, the echo of her voice demanding I articulate my desire. I have gone up there to plant flowers, but I had come down knowing that silence was no longer an option. The text message arrived at 11:14 p.m., glowing harsh and bright in the darkness of my bedroom. It was brief, devoid of pleasantries, and entirely characteristic. The installation is failing. The composition collapses under the overheads. I need you. There was no question of whether I would go. The pull was already there, a hook buried deep in my chest that tugged every time my phone vibrated. I didn't put on my work boots. I didn't tie my hair back in the severe, practical knot I wore to the market. I put on a dress of dark green velvet that I had bought 3 years ago and never worn. A garment that felt less like clothing and more like an admission. It was soft, impractical, and left my neck exposed. I told myself it was because I was in a rush, but the truth was in the way I checked my reflection before leaving. I wasn't going to fix a flower arrangement. I was going to be seen. The gallery at night was a different creature entirely from the pristine, sun-drenched space of the daylight hours. The security shutters were down, sealing the world away. Inside, the main lights were killed, leaving only the track lighting that focused intense, surgical beams on the sculptures. The shadows were long and sharp, stretching across the polished concrete floor like spilled ink. The air was colder, smelling of cured paint and the metallic tang of the bronze statues. It felt like walking into the belly of a sleeping beast. Quiet, but with a pulse you could feel through the soles of your shoes. Cleo was waiting in the main hall. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't wringing her hands over a disaster. She was standing perfectly still in front of the massive floral installation I had finished that afternoon. A cascading wave of amaranth and dark calla lilies designed to mirror the turbulence of the abstract expressionist canvas behind it. She didn't turn when the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me. She just spoke to the room, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, hollow space. "It's holding its breath," she said. I walked toward her, the sound of my heels distinct and rhythmic, a metronome counting down the seconds until the collision. "I followed the sketches," I defended, though my voice lacked conviction. "The lines match the painting." "The lines are correct," Cleo conceded, finally turning to face me. The lighting caught the sharp planes of her face, casting her eyes in shadow while illuminating the severe line of her mouth. She looked tired, but it was a wired, electric kind of exhaustion, the look of someone who has been staring at a problem until it starts to stare back. But the energy is wrong. It's polite. It's apologizing for being in front of the canvas. She looked me up and down. Her gaze didn't skim. It traveled with weight. It started at my shoes, moved up the velvet of the dress, lingered on the pulse fluttering visibly in my throat, and finally locked onto my eyes. She didn't comment on the change of clothes. She didn't have to. The acknowledgement was in the slight widening of her pupils, the subtle shift in her posture. She knew exactly why I had dressed up for a midnight emergency. "Come here," she commanded. I stepped into the pool of light with her. The installation loomed over us, the red, hanging amaranth looking like suspended blood in the stark lighting. "You built this with fear," she murmured, stepping around me, circling me like a shark. "You were afraid to obscure the art, so you made the flowers retreat. You made them small." She stopped behind me. I could feel her presence at my back, a wall of heat against the cool air of the gallery. She reached out, her hands settling heavy on my shoulders. "Art isn't about politeness, Iris," she whispered, her breath ghosting against my ear. "It's about tension. It's about the moment before the break. You know that. I've seen you work. I've seen you strip thorns with a violence that makes me shiver. Where is that violence now?" She reached past me, grabbing a handful of the carefully arranged lilies. With a sudden, sharp movement, she yanked them downward, breaking the symmetry, letting them hang loose and chaotic. "Better," she said. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought she must be able to hear it. "You're ruining it," I breathed. "I'm freeing it," she corrected. She moved closer, her chest brushing against my back. "And I'm trying to free you. You dress in velvet to come see me, but you stand there with your hands clasped tight." She took my wrists, her grip cool and firm, and pulled my hands apart, forcing them down to my sides. She held them there, pinning me in place, leaving me completely open to the room, to the light, to her. "Look at the shadow," she ordered, nodding toward the floor where our silhouettes merged into one long, distorted shape. That is the composition I was looking for. The flowers were just the excuse. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no emergency with the display. The amaranth was fine. She hadn't called me here to fix the arrangement. She had called me here to place me in the center of her room, under her lights, to see if I would finally break the way she wanted me to. I wasn't the artist tonight. I was the subject. And God help me, I didn't want to move. I didn't answer the phone. When it vibrated against the bedside table at 2 a.m., I watched the screen light up the dark room, Cleo's name glowing like a warning flare I was choosing to ignore. I didn't go to the Penthouse on Tuesday. I didn't walk past the gallery. I retreated. I pulled back into the cramped, safe perimeter of my apartment and the familiar, chaotic noise of the flower shop. I buried myself in the mundane safety of wedding season. 300 stems of baby's breath, pastel roses, symmetrical centerpieces that required zero emotional risk. It felt like coming up for air after being held underwater. But the air was stale. It tasted of nothing. The fear was real, and it was specific. It wasn't just about the intensity of that night in the gallery. It was about the realization of what Cleo actually wanted. She didn't just want a gardener to fix her rooftop. She wanted to excavate me. She wanted to peel back the layers of politeness and apology that I had spent 24 years building as a shield against the world. She wanted to see the raw, ugly things underneath. And the terrifying part, the part that kept me awake, staring at the ceiling, was that I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I let her, I wouldn't be able to put the shield back up. I would be exposed. I would be hers. So I ran. I let the calls go to voicemail. I told my boss I was swamped and couldn't take on private commissions. I tried to convince myself that the dull ache in my chest was just relief, that the silence in my head was peace. But the shop felt different now. The buckets of carnations looked cheap. The chatter of customers felt inane, a buzzing of insects against glass. I found myself staring at the cooler, tracing the condensation with my finger, remembering the cool, dry touch of Cleo's hand on my jaw. I was safe, yes, but I was also bored. And Cleo had been right. Safety was boring. It was a flat line. 3 days into my self-imposed exile, the delivery arrived. It wasn't a standard floral courier. It was a private driver in a dark suit who walked into the shop holding a single long box of matte black cardboard. The atmosphere in the shop shifted immediately. The mundane scent of wet leaves was cut by the expensive leather and ozone smell of the intruder. He didn't ask for a signature. He just set the box on the counter in front of me, a dark monolith among the bright, cheerful ribbons, and left without a word. My boss, heavy with curiosity, leaned over the register. "Who's that from? Looks serious." "I don't know," I lied, though my pulse was already thrumming a frantic rhythm in my throat. I took the box to the back room, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a single sempervivum, a succulent that grows in the cracks of rocks, in places where nothing else can survive. But this one was flowering, a rare, star-shaped bloom of deep, violent crimson rising from the tough, armored leaves. It was a plant that thrived on neglect, on harsh conditions, on difficult soil. It was a plant that didn't need to be coddled. It needed to be challenged. There was a card, thick, heavy stalk that felt like fabric. The handwriting was sharp, angular, familiar. "Roots need darkness to take hold, Iris. But if you stay underground too long, you rot. I am patient, but the storm is coming, and I would prefer you face it with me than hide from it." I stared at the flower. It was a brutal, resilient thing. It was an accusation and an invitation wrapped in one. It was a reminder that I wasn't the delicate hydrangea I pretended to be. I was the thing that grew in the cracks. I touched the crimson petal, It was firm, waxy, alive. I had spent my whole life trying to be soft, trying to be palatable. But Cleo didn't want soft. She wanted the thing that could survive the wind on the 42nd floor. She wanted the fight. I closed the box. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But the hunger was stronger. The hunger to be seen, to be known, to be ruined in the beautiful, precise way she promised. I took off my apron. I left the wedding orders on the counter, unfinished. I walked out the back door into the rain that had just started to fall, heavy and gray. I wasn't running away this time. I was running toward the edge of the cliff. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the fall. The city was drowning. The rain wasn't just falling. It was driving sideways, a relentless gray sheet that turned the streets into rivers. I walked the 6 blocks to her building without an umbrella, letting the deluge soak through my coat until the fabric was heavy and clinging. I wanted to feel it. I wanted the cold, sharp shock of the water to numb the frantic rhythm of my pulse. But it didn't work. The closer I got to the tower, the louder the blood roared in my ears. The doorman didn't stop me. He didn't even ask for my name. He just looked at my soaked clothes, the water pooling around my boots on the marble lobby floor, and pressed the button for the elevator. He knew. Everyone seemed to know, but me. The elevator ride was a 40-story ascent in a pressurized coffin. My reflection in the mirrored doors was wild, hair plastered to my skull, mascara likely smeared, chest heaving. I was the storm itself, condensed into a human shape. I didn't have to knock. The door to Unit 402 opened before my hand could even form a fist to strike the wood. Cleo stood there. But she wasn't the untouchable curator in the silk blouse I had met weeks ago. She was barefoot. She was wearing a loose, oversized shirt that hung off one shoulder, and her hair was down, a dark, tangled curtain around her face. She held a glass of dark wine in one hand, her knuckles white against the stem. She looked destroyed. Not broken, but dismantled, like a masterpiece that had been taken off the wall and left on the floor to prove it was real. "You took your time," she said. Her voice was rough, stripped of its usual polished veneer. "I was afraid," I admitted. The truth fell out of my mouth before I could polish it. "Good," she replied, stepping back, pulling the door wider. "Fear means you're paying attention." I stepped inside. The air in the penthouse was different tonight. The ozone smell was gone, replaced by the scent of rain blowing in through a window she had left cracked open. The lights were dim, amber, and low. I dripped onto the floor, a puddle forming around my boots, ruining the perfection of her entryway for the second time. "Why?" I asked. The word was a jagged thing, tearing its way out of my throat. I didn't move further into the room. I stayed on the threshold of the ruin I was making. "Why me, Cleo? I'm a florist. I deliver hydrangeas to rich people who don't look at me. I'm quiet. I'm boring. You have the whole city. Why did you hunt me down?" Cleo set her wine glass on the console table. She didn't use a coaster. The sound of glass on stone was a sharp punctuation mark. She walked toward me, ignoring the water on the floor, ignoring the fact that her bare feet were now wet with the rain I had brought in. "You think you're quiet," she murmured, stopping inches from me. The heat coming off her was palpable, a physical force pushing back the chill of the storm. "But you're not. I watched you strip the thorns off a dozen roses last week. You didn't use gloves. You used your thumb and a knife, and you moved with such absolute certainty. You decided what was beautiful and what was pain, and you removed the pain with a flick of your wrist." She reached out, her hand hovering near my wet shoulder. "It wasn't the flowers, Iris," she whispered, her eyes searching mine, dark and hungry. "It was the violence, the quiet, necessary violence of how you care for things. You cut them to make them drink. You bind them to make them stand. You understand that growth is brutal." "I'm not violent," I shook my head, water flying from my hair. "You are," she corrected, her fingers finally landing on the wet fabric of my coat. She didn't flinch at the cold dampness. She gripped the lapel, her knuckles brushing my collarbone. And I have been waiting a very long time for someone who knows how to handle sharp things without bleeding. The distance between us collapsed. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was gravity. The professional barrier, the delivery girl and the client, the artist and the patron, shattered under the weight of the storm. She pulled me forward, or maybe I fell forward, but suddenly there was no air left in the room, only the terrifying proximity of her breath against my lips, and the realization that the storm wasn't outside anymore. It was right here, in the circle of her arms. "I'm going to ruin your floor," I whispered, a final, desperate attempt to hold on to the rules. "Let it rot," she breathed, her hand sliding up to tangle in my wet hair. "I don't care about the floor. I care about the water." The coat was a heavy, sodden barrier between us, a reminder of the cold world I had walked through to get here. Cleo's hands moved to the lapels, her movements sharp and decisive, shoving the wet wool down my arms. The sound of it hitting the floor was a heavy, wet thud that sealed the rest of the world away. Underneath, I was shivering, not from the chill, but from the sudden, terrifying exposure of being exactly where I wanted to be. The air in the penthouse was no longer cool. It was thick, humid with the storm and the heat radiating from her skin. She didn't step back. She stepped in. Her hands moved from my shoulders to my waist, sliding under the hem of my damp shirt, her palms burning against my ribs. It was a claiming. It was the way a sculptor touches clay, not tentatively, but with the absolute knowledge of what the material is capable of becoming. I gasped, the sound loud in the quiet room, and her eyes darkened, tracking the movement of my throat. "Breathe," she commanded. But it wasn't an order to calm down. It was a challenge to endure the intensity. My hands found their way to her neck. I felt the steady, frantic beat of her pulse under my fingertips, a rhythm that matched my own. She wasn't immune to this. The great curator, the woman who watched the world from behind glass, was shaking. That realization shattered the last of my hesitation. I wanted to be the force that unraveled her. I leaned in, stopping a millimeter from her mouth. The proximity was dizzying. I could smell the wine on her breath, the sharp tang of ozone, and the deep, smoky scent of her skin. It was intoxicating, a sensory overload that made my knees weak. "You said I was violent," I whispered, the words brushing against her lips. "Show me." The kiss wasn't tentative. It didn't ask for permission. The permission had been granted the moment I walked through the door. It was precise. It was slow. It was a collision of two forces that had been circling each other for weeks. Her mouth was soft but demanding, moving against mine with a deliberate, searing pressure that felt like it was rewriting my entire history. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a conversation in a language I hadn't known I spoke until this very moment. I felt the tension leave her body and enter mine. She made a low sound, a vibration against my mouth that traveled straight to my core. Her grip on my waist tightened, pulling me flush against her, dissolving the space between us until there was no me and her, just the overwhelming reality of us. My hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, demanding more pressure, more heat, more of this terrifying, beautiful ruin. There was no artifice here, no gallery lighting to hide behind, just the raw, unvarnished truth of skin on skin, of breath mingling with breath. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was the masterpiece she had been waiting for. We moved blindly, guided only by touch, until the edge of the console table pressed against my lower back, grounding me in the physical world while my mind spun into the ether. "Iris," she breathed against my jaw, her voice wrecked, a beautiful destruction of her usual composure. "Don't hide. Not now." "I'm not hiding," I promised, pressing closer, eliminating the last fraction of distance. "I'm right here." The storm outside raged against the glass, a furious backdrop to the quiet devastation happening inside. I was drowning, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to be saved. I wanted to sink into this, into the heat, the pressure, the absolute precision of her desire. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with the weight of everything we had finally said without speaking. Morning arrived, not with a shout, but with a slow, pale amber light that spilled across the floorboards. The storm had passed, leaving the city below scrubbed clean and silent. I watched the dust motes dance in the sunbeams, then looked down at Cleo's hand resting over mine on the white sheets. It was heavy, grounding, and real. The flowers were still scattered in the hall, dying beautifully, but we were just beginning to take root. If you've ever felt the pull of a gaze you couldn't escape, subscribe for more stories like this.